you no longer live near each other, but you have birthed a child together. Um, and so you have a new book coming out called Baptizing America, and you you have taken the counterintuitive approach of blaming everything that's wrong with American Christianity on mainline Protestantism, and I'm here for that. So I just a mutual friend of all four of us here, Will Williman, has endorsed your book in typical Will fashion. So I just want to read this here up at the top. He writes, a gang of white nationalist crazies stormed the U.S. Capitol, some of them carrying Christian crosses. See what you've done, all you right-wing evangelical preachers? You produce these wackos who can't tell the difference between the kingdom of heaven and the USA. But now come along Bo and Brian with a wallop of a book, well-researched, orthodox, fast-paced, and revealing. My own denomination's supposedly harmless, slightly to the left, God bless America sentimentality is revealed to be a precursor of a mess like January 6th. This book has caused this mainliner to take a sober theological assessment of my church and its unknowing complicity in the naissance of ugly Christian nationalism. Thanks to Baptizing America, I have met the syncretistic, idolatrous, confused nationalist. It turns out that he looks like the nice, middle-of-the-road, moderate Methodist me. Oops.
It's really the oops that makes that endorsement, right?
Ironically enough, Will Willimon baptized my daughter.
Well,
right into Christian nationalism.
When we reached out to him, he was enthusiastically responding, was one of the first to respond. There's a reason that's the first endorsement in the book. We really do like what he said about the book. Like that's about spot on.
Yeah, I think the argument you're making in your book would only be surprising to people who haven't attempted to pastor, say, like a United Methodist congregation. But you know, that's not about me. It's about your book. So give us how this project was. What was the germ of the idea here?
Yeah, so we've been writing about Christian nationalism for years, even pre-January 6th, that using that term of Christian nationalism. And then particularly after January 6th, writing a lot about Christian nationalism there and other things that we'd seen with conservative evangelicals and MAGA Christians. But as we were doing this, one of the things that we began to realize was all of the so-called evidence, air quotes, evidence, that those espousing Christian nationalism point to, whether it be a politician like Mike Johnson or a activist like David Barton or a preacher like Robert Jeffress, the evidence that they point to are things that mainline Protestants put in place and codified. And so then at some point it's like, all right, we've got to go back in the story and realize how we got here, because if we don't really appreciate how we got to this mess in the first place, we're not going to necessarily solve the problem. And so it was something over years of conversation. And then finally, we wrote just a little bit of a kind of a teaser piece as a test case for Religion and Politics publication out of the Danforth Center at Washington University in St. Louis a little over a year ago. And then got some good response to that and said, all right, let's try a whole book length version. Thinking there's got to be more here. And then it was like every week it's like, holy crap, we found even more. Like it was worse than we realized it was going to be.
Yeah. So, Bo, you want to add to that?
No,
don't let Brian steal your thunder here.
Well, I mean, Brian and I will be honest. We're decently intelligent human beings. We have pretty healthy egos. So we had been talking about this topic for some time. It's like, why isn't anybody saying this? As we're blaming the evangelicals, the fundamentalists, the Trumpian Christians, why is nobody talking about this? So yeah, that test piece went up. And it was kind of like, let's see what kind of response we get. Does anybody shoot us down because we missed something? Because we're not the historians. We're not the theologians. We're communications and public policy scholars. And so we sent that up. We got some great response, honestly, from mainline Protestant leaders who emailed us and was like, exactly, we need to be talking about this from some of the Christian nationalism scholars that we all admire. And so that really was what convinced us to try to go to the whole book, was the feedback we got from that piece, knowing that we were just kind of dipping our toe in the water to seeing if somebody's going to cut it off or if we actually had something here.
I mean, one of the things that you've pointed out in this book is really the cosplay of January 6th. A lot of the Christian nationalist stuff on the right is just a tackier, more garish version of stuff that happens in mainline churches. We just had Scout Sunday at my church a couple of Sundays ago, right? And so I always make it a point to like not be in the sanctuary when they're doing their stuff at the beginning of the service because it makes me uncomfortable. But that's, it's also not a hill I want to die on. And so I ignore it.
I will never forget two churches ago that I served at. It was Memorial Day weekend. The senior pastor was on vacation. I was a youth director at this place. And the organist came up to me and said, "Here, we have a problem." And I'm like, "Okay, I'm here. What's the problem?" "The Boy Scouts aren't here yet, and we need someone to hold the flag so that we can say the Pledge of Allegiance before worship." And I said, "No, thank you," and walked away. And left that church 2 months later.
See, I admire you all. When I did live by Bryan, Missouri, my church went through the same thing. We had a great scout troop. I really admire the leaders. We, wanted to be supportive of them. But yeah, when we do Scout Sunday, Christian nationalism is present every single time. The Pledge of Allegiance, the flag in the sanctuary. So we got around it by saying we're going to do it before the call to worship. So worship hasn't really started yet. But of course, that's just a rationalization. It's still happening in the sacred space. Yeah. And, the disciples have a scout person who's in charge of organizing sort of scouts across the denomination. I think that's probably true in a lot of the mainline churches. Like, this is something we've encouraged and we've been comfortable with because the mainline church, if you go back to the mid-20th century, we were very comfortable bringing culture and church together. We didn't see a dissonance there. And now that we're living out this divergence between what we see as American Christianity in some places and what's happening in our politics, we want to be critical of it. But what we really got to start by doing is being critical of ourselves because we helped create this.
Yeah. A tier story reminds me. So when I got to a previous church I served, the tier also worked at for a time.
Well, you just named the church. Everybody listening knows what that church is.
So in 2005, at every worship service, every Sunday, right after the offering, right after the doxology, they would sing a verse of America, facing the cross, standing up. And I was, and so I'd be up there with the offering plate. I'm like, is the cross going to burst into flames? And I'm going to
Smolder's Gate, right?
I'm going to get melted like the guy in the Raiders of the Lost Ark. And it took, so, we first took it out during, I think, Advent, and then we took it out during Lent. And we, over time, got them adjusted to not having it be present in worship, except for maybe the 4th of July or something. But that took an extraordinarily, intentional process. And there were still a lot of complaining. And then, so I was there for 14 years. And then as soon as I left, next guy. Yeah. Because the way that we move in the Methodist system, his first Sunday is 4th of July weekend. He does a little video during COVID, right? Online worship. He's standing in front of the flag, quoting, greater love, no greater love, and laying down your, and I'm just and my point is, it's so deep in the bones of mainline Christians that you can take it away from them for 10 years, but as soon as you reintroduce it, they unlearn everything you've tried to impress upon them.
And Jason, do you know when that practice started? Do you have any idea of the origins of that singing of that verse every week?
It was, I think, in the mid 70s they had started doing it. I think
the time of war.
Yeah, so I think they'd had a pastoral leadership crisis, and the lay leaders kind of took the church and steadied it. And of course, they all worked at the Pentagon, and they did what they knew from military chapels. And yeah, it's crazy. I mean, you've identified something that I think every pastor knows, but nobody talks about. And a great example of this here in DC is the point you make in chapter 7. And so you talk about Lafayette Square. So fill out the context of Lafayette Square and the hypocrisy of people like us who maybe like lost their minds when Donald Trump stood in front of the church with the Bible in his hand.
Yeah.
Upside down.
Yeah,
Bible
this is
upside down.
this is one of our favorite stories, right? So there you have, they clear the square for whatever reason. There's some disputes over that, but the point is, there's this photo op where Donald Trump, who is born in the Presbyterian Church, influenced by the mainline Presbyterianism, is standing in front of St. John's Episcopal Church, a mainline Protestant congregation, holding up the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, right? A copy of the Bible, created by mainline Protestant influences, and we all got outraged by it, and we should have been. And the Episcopal bishop spoke out, and the congregational pastor said something, and we were all angry. But on the flip side, that's the Church of the Presidents, the church every president has worshipped since 19 something. And there's a pew in that church that was reserved, paid for, I don't know, endowed, I'm not sure what the word is, by John Tyler, hundreds of years ago, because so the president would always have a place to worship in DC. So if you're Donald Trump and you're looking at the White House and you look across from Lafayette Square and you see St. John's, of course you think that's my church to use as a prop. I literally own a pew in there.
Ironically, John Tyler was also an insurrectionist. But
it also brings up this tension. I mean, that's a church, and they're really social justicely minded. Like they do great ministry, but they're living this tension. Part of it's the geography of where they are, part of it's their history, but they're stuck at this tension. And I would imagine it's very difficult for them to deal with day in and day out. We don't know their response to the book yet. We're eager to hear it. We'd like to do an event there because we'd like to really talk about it and hear how they manage this.
Well, if they turn you down, you could try to do a book signing at the United Methodist Building, which is right near the Supreme Court.
Right.
Yeah, we are also guilty. And I mean, reading your book, United Methodists aren't even critical of, maybe it's problematic that our entire church governance was designed to mimic the structure of the United States government. It's not just the trappings of worship, and our liturgy and our prayers. It's how we are structured as a denomination. Yeah,
and I think the key here, though, as we're saying, is it's not just that there's this tension in this history. It's that then by embracing being the Church of the Presidents, I mean, because that's what St. John's calls itself. It's not just the title that others they're excited about that status. Then they give up their prophetic voice at times when it's most needed. And I think, Trump has been particularly helpful in showing that we cannot serve two masters. I mean, I know Jesus taught us that, but, a lot of presidents did the nice thing and they helped us, make us feel comfortable about, being citizens of both kingdoms and pretending like everything was, perfectly together. But Trump just shows the contradiction. It cannot exist. And so, St. John's had already hosted Donald Trump in their sanctuary, as they do for lots of pastors for around the inauguration, lots of presidents around the inauguration. But they didn't provide the sermon for that inauguration event. They let the incoming president pick, and so they hosted a sermon by Robert Jeffress, Southern Baptist, MAGA church pastor, who had specifically already said that he would vote for Trump over Jesus, because he didn't want some meek and mild, turn the other cheek guy. He wanted the toughest SOB. I mean, that's how he had put it. And so here they are providing the safe space, the sanctuary for a Robert Jeffress sermon, becoming part of the problem instead of being a prophetic voice at a time when we needed a prophetic voice.
Well,
and that's the difficult part, right? If you're going to be, I'm on their website now, the Church of the Presidents. At times, as a pastor, Jason knows this well, you have to tell your congregation no. You have to tell the people in your congregation no. This is the opposite of what we have been called to do. It's the opposite of what we have been called to be, and you're gonna piss people off when that happens. But not that you're seeking to piss people off in everything that you do. But if you're doing it right, there are going to be times when you rub up against the traditional American norms that people want to bring in because they see it eroding everywhere else in the community.
Yeah, and I think that's the key throughout the book. But I think John's is a great example. You just can't be both. You can't be the government church and the prophetic church, and you're going to have to pick a side. And we're hoping that we can call mainline Protestants like St. John's, like United Methodists, to say it's time to choose Jesus over government.
Well, and I think maybe to show some grace too, your book points out why a Christian on the right might see themselves as not doing anything different or more dangerous than Christians on the other end of the political spectrum. But they're not unique.
Yeah.
In some sense, I think that one of the traps we fall into for Christians on the left, or however we want to talk about it, is we like to critique what's happening on the right. We get angry, we get outraged. It's cathartic to scream and yell on Facebook or preach the sermon denouncing X, Y, and Z that's happening over there. But what the book is really calling for, it's kind of a love letter in a way to the mainline church of saying, let's interrogate ourselves here, right? We all agree this is a problem. They're not going to listen to us over there, right? Like Greg Locke does not care what Brian and I think. We've come to terms with that. We've come to accept that. But we do have influence in other spaces, in mainline spaces and other progressive Christian spaces where people do, listen to us. And, you all are in congregations, you've got influence in your churches. Let's create a conversation about this and our complicity in this, in those spaces where we have some influence. If you think of Christian nationalism as one big pie, let's work on our piece of the pie. Not that we can't be angry about what's going over there. We should be, but we also can deal with it, and we can actually make more headway in those spaces where we have a lot more influence.
Yeah, I remember, I think maybe it was 2019, 2018.
Simpler times back then.
I went to the Festival of Homiletics that was here in DC.
Yep.
And Elizabeth Warren was one of the quote unquote preachers there. And so was Cory Booker.
I was gonna say that was the same year Cory Booker was going to bring the word, right?
Yeah. And I was so uncomfortable that if in that same event, if you picked out two, conservative senators and they were featured as speakers at a religious event, progressive Christians would lose their minds. And what bothered me especially was the assumption that Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker spoke for everybody in the room. Mm-hmm. That it wasn't. There was no expectation of people who disagree with them being present, and that's a very bad definition of church.
Well, it brings up my favorite story in the book, which is, we do this thought experiment. Imagine that Donald Trump's in the Rose Garden receiving a new version of the Bible from Paula White and all of his, sort of spiritual advisors. You can imagine the outrage that would be present from disciples, pastors, and Methodist pastors, whatever, people who would be screaming about how awful this was and the Christian nationalism of it all. And this actually happened, right? Like in 1952, when the first, edition of the Revised Standard Version of the Bible came off the press, they gave the very first copy, they being the National Council, a delegation of National Council of Churches leaders, to President Harry Truman in the Rose Garden. They had this whole ceremony, and Truman's like, I used the Bible to justify my foreign policy, and wouldn't it be great if everybody just read the Bible more? We'd all have a peaceful world. I mean, if they did today what we did back then, we'd go nuts. And yet we don't even know that story, and we don't really understand like what was happening there, and we aren't willing to critique or interrogate what was happening there.
Yeah, until recently, the United Methodist Church and a lot of other mainline denominations had their mission offices at a building, a skyscraper in New York, right by Riverside Church on the edge of Harlem. And I think on the first floor of that building, there was an exhibit showing the parade through the streets of New York to lay the cornerstone for that building that President Eisenhower laid.
Yep.
And so and the challenge I have found as a pastor is that the generation of a lot of the lay leaders I've had, the kind of the baby boom generation, American civil religion is such a part of their Christianity. They can't distinguish it from Christianity. So when I've tried to talk about this kind of stuff, it's like I'm speaking a different language.
That's right. I mean, I think for those of us, which is all four of us, that grew up in white Christian churches in the U.S., Christian nationalism is just in the air we breathe. It's just part of like what it means to be in the church. And the problem we have today, the difficult task we have today, is now how do we separate the wheat and the chaff? How do we decide what was American and what was actually the gospel? I mean, we've talked a little bit about the American flags. I mean, that's a great example because in most congregations, they don't show up until World War II. I mean, we talk in the book. There's a few examples in World War I, a little bit before that, but for most churches, the flag comes into the sanctuary in World War II, which means for the majority of American Christianity, and particularly the majority of Christianity, the flags weren't there.
Is that because, to what extent is that because a lot of Christians sorted themselves out by ethnic group before that?
So the ethnic group issue is definitely part of it. And so that's why you see earlier, like World War I, you'll see some of your German ethnic group congregations will start flying the American flag to prove their loyalty. Sometimes it was demanded of them to prove their loyalty, that they were American first and not German anymore. And so, but with World War II, that general patriotism grows much more, and we see it going through the churches. And so, I mean, particularly, churches, if you're at a church that's, more than 160 years old, that means for even more than half of your church, your own church's lifespan, you didn't have a flag there. But for the life of basically everyone in the pews, or at least their memory life that they have, the flag has always been there. Mm-hmm. So it feels like just the way things are supposed to be and the way things have always been, but it's actually still a pretty recent aberration.
It's interesting.
Jason, you brought up the concept of civil religion, and I think that's probably the chapter in the book that we had the most trepidation about, because it's obviously a topic that has been explored by a lot of scholars. There's huge, complex debates over it that we are, just kind of interlopers on. But, this line between where does civil religion end and Christian nationalism begin is more blurry than we think a lot of people articulate, and maybe doesn't even exist at all. And I think that's one of the, we all thought this was innocuous, right? We thought bringing flags in the sanctuary was helpful to the country and helpful to the church. We didn't see any conflict there. And so we've become accustomed to this idea that these two things just go together so easily and so well. And now we're made really uncomfortable by, again, the way we're seeing them used by others we disagree with. And we've got all of these layers that we have to peel back. And ultimately, what we have to do is get a little more, I think, critical of this whole concept of civil religion, because it's far from being innocuous. It's proven to be quite harmful.
Yeah. So Brian, you're more the history expert than I am, but I have thought, as it seems like as the bonds of our republic are fraying.
I don't know what you're talking about, Jason.
So, not long ago, I reread a bunch of Jonathan Edwards, and I was reminded that Edwards was skeptical of democracy because he did not think it was possible unless above it, anchoring it, was a common belief in the sovereignty of God. And part of me wonders if that's what we're suffering now, is what happens when the Republican Party no longer believes in God. So I don't know how to reconcile my distaste with civil religion with my agreement with Edwards.
I don't know. Maybe I don't agree with Edwards, and so maybe it's not as hard of an issue for me. I mean, I don't know. Someone who's writing his sermon on the back of a receipt of someone a human being that he bought and enslaved, I'm not sure necessarily has a great concept of God.
All right, that's a good comeback. All right, that's a good comeback.
but in reality, this is something you hear with Christian nationalism today, right? Is that we need this unifying principle. And so, as you all know, I come from the Baptist tradition. And so maybe we think about democracy a little bit differently because in the early stages of our country's founding, the so-called Christian states, the colonies that we had, where there was actual colony state church, Virginia and Massachusetts and so forth, Baptists are being put in prison for what they're preaching. And so we've seen what Christian nationalism looks like. And
Mhm.
even when you have a government supposedly based on God, it's only a small sliver. I mean, that's what Christian nationalists today want. When they say they want a Christian nation, they don't mean you all. They don't mean the four of us don't get to rule the government if we become a Christian nation. They mean a very narrow slice
Yes.
of conservative Christianity. It's the same thing we see in Russia today. I mean, Russia
Yeah,
is an
yeah.
example of a Christian nationalistic state where the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian government are essentially synonymous. I mean, it feels like, the end of Animal Farm, where you're looking at the pigs and the humans and you can't tell which one's which. I mean, that's the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian government. And
And
Jehovah's Witnesses.
yeah, I mean, that's a good, because, most people do not go to church in Russia, and most say they don't believe in God, but they identify
Right.
as, yeah.
And they are persecuting non-believers. And I mean, the Jehovah's Witnesses are the most persecuted religious group in Russia, but Baptists are second and Pentecostals are third, ahead of even Muslims, being by the hundreds every year, being arrested, fined, imprisoned. And this has been going on for years before the invasion of Ukraine. That's what a quote Christian nation looks like. It only means one little piece of Christianity. So I guess I don't think that a democracy based on Christianity actually will be a democracy. The Christian nationalism is inherently anti-democratic because it never truly allows pluralism. It never truly allows those with a different perspective to be treated as equal citizens.
So given that perspective, let's return to where we started. Were you surprised by January 6th?
I mean, we won't say that we weren't surprised by the violence of it, although the threat of violence had been growing. I was watching it with shock and horror, but it is fascinating to go back and see what I think the Washington Post the day before had an article warning about violence and the violent threats on January 6th. So like the warning signs were there. I will say the Christian nationalism didn't surprise me, but that's because I had been to some of the Stop the Steal rallies before January 6th. So I live in a state capital.
You went to Stop the Steal rallies?
I did. I mean, I didn't have the signs. I went to go see them.
Glutton for punishment.
I know, right? So it was the Saturday after the election, which was ironically when they called the election for Biden. And I'm driving to the state capitol here in Missouri as they make the call officially on the radio. And I thought, well, this will be interesting. I wonder if this will take any of the wind out of the rally. No, it didn't. And I mean, as soon as I got downtown, I knew that we were in for it. I mean, the trucks were clogging all the streets on a Saturday, which is usually downtown is pretty empty, with their Trump flags and everything flying. Hundreds of people were lined up at the Capitol. And as I walked around, I went really just for the political side. But as I was there, I started seeing the Christian flag, an Appeal to Heaven flag, crosses. I was seeing handmade signs talking about God and draining the swamp and all of this. And so I was kind of already primed and realizing the religion and the Christian nationalism that was getting in the Stop the Steal rally. I went to another one because I really am a glutton for punishment. On January 6th, I thought I'm going to head over to the state capitol, see the beginning of the Stop the Steal rally, and then I'm going to head home and watch C-SPAN because I'm a nerd and see what happens in the vote there. And so again, this time I'm watching for it. I see the Christian signs and the Christian flag and all of that at the Capitol here in Missouri. And then I go home and I'm watching the crowd on January 6th as they storm the Capitol. So I'm already primed for it. And I am seeing all of the Christian nationalism symbols there. So I wasn't surprised by the Christian nationalism we saw on January 6th because it was so embedded in the movement already.
Yeah, I think it was David French wrote right after that you don't really understand the insurrection unless you understand it as a Christian act. That it was filled with Christian iconography.
Well, and so I live where I used to live about a quarter mile from where all of those folks were staying in the hotels and everything just outside DC. And I remember being in that part of Arlington the next day and seeing all of those people walk around, and how different the atmosphere was from the day from January 5th. Because January 6th there was lockdown. I think what was it, Jason? Like 6 p.m. around here, it was like
Mm-hmm.
like a curfew, can't go anywhere. But then, so January 5th was very excited. Everybody had their red hats on, walking around. But then come January 7th, there was not a red hat to be found up there, as they were packing up and leaving.
So I certainly will confess being shocked at January 6th, 2021, but something that Brian has really put front and center for me and for others is also the shock of January 6th, 2022, right? So it's that 1 year anniversary and how that was commemorated in a way that sadly reinforced some of the problems we're talking about.
I don't even know what you're talking about. What happened?
So we start the book here with January 6th, 2022, which is it's supposed to be this moment of commemorating what happened, and mostly Democrats, because the Republicans by that point had decided it was just a normal tourist visit and nothing to be ashamed of, and so they hold a vigil, if you will, on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, and it's only 8 minutes long. It's really short. I mean, again, I'm a nerd. I pulled it up. I'm watching it live on C-SPAN or C-SPAN 2. I don't remember which one it was on, but I'm watching it, and I was shocked by how quick it was over, but also by how Christian it was. And literally only one person prayed at this vigil, and it was the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. And he prayed that God would make this one nation under God, and that the lawmakers would enact God's will. They sang a couple of those hymns that we sing on July 4th at most of our mainline churches and evangelical churches from the hymnal. And that was it. It was Christian politicians, Christian songs, and a Christian pastor praying. And that's Christian nationalism, but it was coming from the left. It was coming from Democrats, and it was coming from mainline Protestants. So it shows that they don't understand what happened, right? Like to take the David French's point that you mentioned, Jason, if you can't understand January 6th without looking at the Christian nationalism part, well, that's the failure that we have right now in our government. The leadership of the Democratic Party doesn't understand January 6th. They proved it. And the January 6th committee, which completely left Christian nationalism out of its hundreds of pages of report.
Mm-hmm.
They don't. They refuse to deal with how we actually got here.
So Bishop Curry's prayer was, "We need your help, Lord, now to be the democracy you would have us to be the nation you would have us to be, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." Notice the absence of Jesus or the church in that prayer.
But also, this is, if I'm remembering correctly, it was organized by the Speaker's office, by Speaker Pelosi's office. So it's an officially sanctioned event. There's one voice claiming to speak for all Americans, right? And again, I like Michael Curry a lot, but if back to your comments about Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker at the Festival of Homiletics, what is he actually doing there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who is he speaking for? What it raises a lot of questions that start to get pretty uncomfortable pretty quickly.
Yeah, Well, I just read last week that President Biden, before he makes any kind of major moral decision, consults with Chris Coons, because he has a divinity degree from Yale, and this stuff is everywhere.
And we're not, I'm not saying, I'll let Brian speak for himself. I expect every president to have their own moral compass, their own religious beliefs, and that's obviously going to influence who they are. But again, Christian nationalism is a call to encode that into public policy, right? It's an attempt to really make this the official way the nation operates. And it sort of is taking this private religious belief that we all have and trying to say this is what the public has to ascribe to. It's something beyond that, I think, of as far as Biden consulting Coons.
Yeah, the definition you guys offer in your book from two sociologists, that Christian nationalism in the United States is a cultural framework, a collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, and value systems that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civil life.
And the important thing about the Whitehead Perry definition is also that they do, when they look at Christian nationalism, they talk about it on a continuum. So it's not you're a Christian nationalist or you're not. is that there are like the full-fledged ambassadors that are out there advocating it. There are people that generally accept it and like it. There are people that maybe like some of it, that don't like some of it, right? And then you have full-fledged rejectors, but there's a continuum. And I think that's really helpful for exactly what we're talking about, because it's easy to look at the Christian nationalism that you see on January 6th, storming the Capitol, and thinking, well, I'm not that. I'm not a Christian nationalist. And so what we're saying, but it's all a continuum. And so your church or your personal leaning here may not be that strong on Christian nationalism, but is there still some Christian nationalism embedded in your own church, in your own denomination, that we could work on, even if it's at a smaller degree, even if it's, less violent and it's a nicer, friendlier, happier version of it? Is there still some Christian nationalism that we can work to carve away and detox from?
Well, and you write that it's the definition of Christian nationalism can't just be God talk with which we politically disagree, and it's and for me that's kind of the irritation for me, and probably my own blind spot, where it's the political nature of the conversation where my disagreements start with that's my starting point, and not a theological or doctrinal position, for where I get uncomfortable with a lot of this, or most all of it.
And I think so. You mentioned immigration in the Safe Sanctuary program in a later chapter, but immigration, I think, is a good example of where Christians on the left do act as though it is the job of the United States government to enact biblical principles. So it's certainly not the case that conservative Christians are the only ones that want to legislate their Christian convictions.
We liberal Christians love quoting the Bible when it comes to immigration.
Yeah,
not much else, but that's one of our favorite spots.
And so I can't remember who we had on the podcast who pointed out that there's no example in the Old Testament of a prophet going to a pagan king and telling him how he should treat the poor or the stranger. That these are expectations that exist within the covenant community, and it's not fair to impose them on people who haven't signed up for that covenant.
Whoever that was a great word.
He's probably a Baptist. I think it was John Nugent. I think that's who it was. Yeah. So I mean, what do you want to? What are you hoping to stir up with this book?
Sales, Jason. They're trying to stir up sales.
Right. That's why we're here.
Well, it's funny. In the acknowledgments we wrote that this book doesn't really have an audience, right? If you're a Republican, we're going to make you mad. If you're a Democrat, we're going to make you mad. If you're an evangelical or mainliner, we're going to tick you off. This is you mentioned it's a little bit of a contrarian book, but what we are hoping to do is that we're creating a resource here, especially for mainline pastors and churches. As we all talked at the beginning, there's a lot of this. It makes us uncomfortable. We don't know how to talk about it. We don't know how to deal with it. A lot of pastors have pulled that flag out of the sanctuary and created chaos in their congregations. There's a better way to have this conversations, and we want this book to be a resource for accomplishing that. So we hope by looking at some of the history a little bit, we'll create new spaces for conversation by offering a little bit of sort of, theological reflection on what's going on around some of this. We create space for, again, what does it mean to be Christian in 2024 in the United States? That, whether it's a Sunday school class, whether it's a pastor thinking about a sermon series, that there's enough here to really create space, because it's us saying it, right? It's not the pastor saying it. It's not, it's an outside voice trying to offer perspective that we think can help mainline churches kind of wrestle with the Christian nationalism in our country and the Christian nationalism in their midst.
That's good.
Yeah, I think one of the things we really are clear about, the first step in the end, when we're like, we have a bunch of steps. Here's some things we'd like you to do after you've read this book. Or the first step is look at your own church. Look at your own denomination. Look at your own tradition. What kind of Christian nationalism do you see that? And we try to practice that. We confess in the book that we have not lived this out in our own churches and our own ministries. And we also have a moment where we critique our publisher of our book for publishing Christian nationalistic stuff in the past. And that's like, we're literally an equal opportunity offender here. And that's a lot of fun. And we appreciate our publisher for letting us critique them in our book that they're publishing. But look at your own church and your own denomination. That's the first step that we hope people will take from the book.
Yeah, if the powers that be from Child's Press are listening, we're not sure that they've read that part yet. So
It may not make it to the final printing.
So one of my favorite anecdotes in your book is January 2019. I didn't know about this, so I don't watch Fox News. So in January 2019, House Democrats considered removing "So Help Me God" from the end of oaths administered to witnesses swearing to tell the truth. Although often said, the phrase is generally not included in the official required language. For instance, presidents today utter that phrase, even though it's not in the oath spelled out word for word in the Constitution. A nun likely used it before Chester Arthur in 1881. Nonetheless, the move by Democrats, even though some Republicans had omitted the phrase in previous hearings, sparked headlines on Fox News and conservative Christian websites. Liz Cheney quickly took the bait. It is incredible, but not surprising, that the Democrats would try to remove God from committee proceedings in one of their first acts in the majority, she argued. They really have become the party of Karl Marx. I didn't even I didn't even know that was a thing that happened.
I mean, honestly, it's hard to keep up with all of the like crazy moments when we throw a fit about God supposedly being kicked out of government or whatever. And I think this is, again, not only is this Christian nationalism, it's also a great example of that idea that only certain Christians are even defined in. I mean, there are some Christians like Mennonites that wouldn't even take an oath historically, let alone adding the, so help me God part, the religious side of the oath. And so by saying that that's like Karl Marx, I mean, it wouldn't be the first time Mennonites have been called Marxists, but I mean, that's essentially excommunicating from Christianity a whole section. I say this as someone who was a member of a Mennonite Church USA congregation for like.
In Harrisonburg, right?
Yeah, what's that? Yes, that's right. Yeah, in Harrisonburg, Virginia. So I am very much still a Mennonite at heart. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to get elected, but if I were ever elected to something, I wouldn't add that at the end of the oath. So, it is what it is.
Well, I mean, speaking of Mennonites, wasn't that guy who ran for governor or Senate in Pennsylvania, wasn't he a Mennonite?
Yeah.
Like the shofar blowing right wing.
Yeah, Doug Mastriano, who
that's his name. Yeah,
who was convinced that God had prophesied that he would be the next governor, and that's why God had called him to run for president and then lose by like 20 points or something.
He's the one that dressed like the Obergruppenführer, right?
Yes.
Well,
yes.
And one of the things that we learned in covering him as we were talking to, religious leaders sort of in Pennsylvania ground, that there is a sort of extremism even happening within some of the Mennonite community.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the division in our politics is seeping into all of our churches, even the Mennonites.
Yeah. So, all right. So that's a good point, Bo. So what I want to hear you guys speak to is what does a healthy Christian care for the nation look like?
So we were talking earlier about sort of how to understand the relationship between Christianity and democracy. And my justification of it is this. I do believe as a pastor, God wants all of us to flourish. And I think that democracy creates a space where everybody has the best chance of flourishing. So I can get on the board of saying, let's support American democracy, not because it's God ordained, but because it allows the church to do the work of the church, and it allows as many people as possible to experiencing the flourishing that God intends for them. So in our public life, I think supporting democracy, to me, that flows out of my Christian commitments, not because democracy itself is Christian, but because democracy allows the church to be the church and allows the flourishing that God intends. So I think we start there in this moment of let's be supportive of American democracy. And then let's be honest about who we are. Like, yes, let's talk. You mentioned immigration earlier. We can talk about our values. We can give a witness. We can be in the public square like others, but let's not seek to impose our views on others. And then, as you all were hinting at, let's not try to substitute the government for the church on the right or on the left. Because the reason I'm serving the church is I think the church has a lot of power to it. I think God's doing something inside the church. I think the Spirit's moving among us, and I want to make sure we're not neglecting that or even discounting that because we're turning everything over to the government.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I would just add, I think a key part of the church is you have to be willing to critique every side. And that's what is too often failing in our public engagement as Christians is you can tell what party's in the White House based on which Christian leaders are constantly showing up at the White House for meetings. You can find somebody that will criticize. I mean, Trump has exposed this on the right, but the left is not better at it. They'll criticize the other side for doing something, but then when it's our guy, it's our side, then it's okay. And that's a party first. That's not a principle first approach. And so that's one of the easy, well, not easy, obviously, but it's one of the first key steps is we've got to learn how to be that prophetic voice, regardless who is in charge. And I do think Christians should be engaging the public square. I mean, I go and testify at the Missouri House half a dozen or more times every year on key legislation, but it's about how we make that argument. It's an argument of testifying and advocating for legislation that's not just for more power and privilege for me and my people, but how do we make this a better state or a better country for everyone, and how we ground those arguments that even though I might show up and care about an issue because of my faith, I'm not demanding that the politicians adopt the bill because of my faith. That I can make an argument of why this is still good for everyone, regardless of what their faith tradition might be.
What can you name a bill or an issue that you have testified in favor of that would make your progressive Christian friends uncomfortable?
So, I mean, I often show up and testify on church state issues. And part of that has been because I have realized, well, one, that's where Christian nationalism is. And I've also learned that if I show up and testify on these bills, that normally what happens is on one side, you have a bunch of conservative Christians arguing for a perspective. And on the other side, it will be me and atheists and Satanists. And that's pretty much like the group, right? And so I go and just disrupt the image. See, it's
this is very biblical. This is Brian eating with the tax collectors and all that.
Yeah. So, right. And so that's part of my job, I guess, is just disrupt the image of hey, let's not just base this on religion because Christians don't all agree on this. But so in that, I mean, I'll be honest, I don't really have a chance to advocate for bills right now in Missouri.
Okay.
Because we have a red super majority in both houses. And so really a good day is when nothing gets passed. And so that's, they control what gets to add, what even gets a hearing for. But my job is to try to limit the amount of damage that is being done.
Okay. Well, I mean, you have a very theologically astute senator from your state.
I assume you're talking about the Senator Fist Pump and Run, but there's a critique that can be leveled about either one of them, but the other one's not famous. So
people still send me his piece on Pelagianism that he wrote before January 6th. It's yeah.
I think that's why Bo left the state. So.
Yeah. So Bo, yeah. What surprised you in writing this?
I mean, we've only told a few of the stories. It really was we would write different chapters and then share them back and forth. And I mean, we have a very collaborative process. We've been at this for a while, and it was amazing. One of us was like, "Can you believe I just found this?" Right? I mean, there were so many stories that we didn't know about going into the book that there are just over and over and over again. Whether it's under God, whether it's there's just all these different things that we assume as normal that mainline Protestants help create. And then again, David Barton is out there saying, well, it's because of this that we know the U.S. is a Christian nation, and that this is something mainline Protestants helped create. So there was a lot of those kind of stories. Frankly, it was worse than we imagined it to be. And we know we didn't get to the bottom of it. I mean, we know that there's more books you could write on all of this stuff, but we needed to start filling in some of the gap.
One of the things that you guys do a good job of at Word and Way is connect to stories like the ones you include in the book in your weekly email blast. And frequently there's stories that I wouldn't come across in the Washington Post, say, or the New York Times. And so I'm wondering from the two of you, so I have, it has struck me how poorly the press has done reporting on Viktor Orban's visit to Mar-a-Lago, and just how he is evidence of what you're addressing here in terms of how church and state, nation, and Christian identity get wrapped up in a particular ideology. So just talk about this ideological network that is larger than just the United States.
Well, Jason, I'm just a little disappointed that you would critique the guy for wanting to take a Florida vacation. I just don't understand your concern.
Especially as someone who just got back from, maybe he was at Disney World while you were there.
I do not like Florida.
Did you enjoy the President's show while you were down there? The Hall of America, is that what it's called?
The one thing that's really important in the question that you just asked is that this is not a uniquely American problem. And our book is, I mean, it's in the title, Baptizing America. We are focused on the American side and the American Christian nationalism. And this book is geared towards American mainline pastors and church leaders and Sunday school teachers. But the threat goes beyond that. And I think it's a threat that happens naturally anywhere. David Gushee, I think, has probably captured this, well in his recent book, Defending Democracy Against Christian Enemies. He talks about the threat, the attacks on democracy, not just in the U.S., but also in Hungary and other countries as well right now. So that's something that's happening constantly, that we see this attraction for an authoritarian strongman who will, protect our values, who will enshrine our values, that will save our country from changing demographics and those migrants that are coming in. I mean, it's all the same rhetoric that Orban's using that we hear from Trump. And I mean, I get it. Like there is that natural attraction to wanting to be a winner, of wanting to see your side in power, of wanting to see your values lived out. I mean, if you think that Christianity really is what matters, if you think it really is what makes lives better, then you think, well, then everybody should live this way. And you know what? Why not just take the shortcut? I mean, that's the temptation that's been there from Constantine to Nazi Germany to Orban to and not just Trump now, but mainline Protestants in the middle of the last century. I mean, that's the temptation of, let's just codify this, let's just do it. But it never works out well. I mean, we don't have this quote in the book, but it's one that I've used a lot, and I do love it. But Tony Campolo has put it well, that mixing church and state is like mixing ice cream and manure. It doesn't hurt the manure, but it sure messes up the ice cream. And that temptation, when you mix church and state, it always goes badly for the church and for the gospel.
So, Jason, earlier you asked if January 6th surprised us, and I'll be honest, like, what has really surprised me is, in all the political science literature I've read in my years of study, is that, the whole theory of our elections is that parties compete. And when one party loses power, they move, they try to adjust their position so that they come towards the median voter, and so they can regain the majority, right? That's how democracy works. And we kind of saw this after the 2008 election with the Republican kind of post-mortem that the RNC did, that said, be more welcoming, be more engaging towards, Hispanic communities, and moderate language on this, that, and the other. That was the idea going on, that the Republicans needed to move more towards the center because they were no longer able to win elections without doing that. What has surprised me is the Democratic backsliding, right? That we've seen, instead of trying to win a majority of voters and win elections, it's, let's change the rules, let's minimize democracy, let's do other things to keep us in power. And that slide into authoritarianism that we see in like a Viktor Orban is really scary. And it is not some place that, if you had told me 10 years ago or 15 years ago that we'd be here today, I wouldn't have thought that was possible.
So this is far afield from your book, but not from you guys' work overall. Let's say Donald Trump loses the election in November. What happens?
First of all, he says he won. He's never admitted an election that he's lost. I mean, he even still claims that he won the Iowa caucuses in 2016. Ted Cruz beat him. I mean, he has never admitted a loss, and that shouldn't have been surprising in 2020, that he was not going to admit that he lost. So he will claim that it was stolen from him. But what's going to be worse is people are being primed for violence right now. The next insurrection has already started. The Trump, quote, prophets, who told us in 2020, well, first they told us in 2016 that he had been ordained to win. And they told us in 2020 that he was going to win again. And that was part of the religious fueled part of January 6th was, well, God promised that Trump was going to win. So clearly it's been stolen, which, side note, seems to be a really weak God. I mean, if God has ordained Trump to win, a little bit of, the Democratic Party is not organized enough to take away an election that God has already planned out. Let's just be honest here. And so they're saying it again. Lance Wallnau, like all these guys are saying, Donald Trump is coming back. The second coming is here. Is God's will. And so then when it happens, if he loses, people are going to say, whoa, wait a minute, but God wanted him in power. And if God wants this, then we better do everything we can to help make sure God's will is done to save our nation. So, I mean, I'm very fearful of either Trump winning or also of Trump losing and then trying to provoke violence. And by the way, this time we have a Speaker of the House who has gone along with all of this and tried to help overturn the election last time and thought that it was God's will that Trump win last time. And it says that he thinks it's God's will that Trump will win this time. I mean, it's a worse case scenario than we had 4 years ago.
So flip it around and bring it back to the subject of your book. Should a pastor like Tier Hardy in the United Methodist Church,
why don't use my name? These people are now going to contact me.
Should Tier Hardy treat the prospect of Trump's return as a status confessionis, as Bonhoeffer would say, or should he opt out and not imbue this campaign with any sort of religious fervor?
So my answer to that would be that Reverend Tier Hardy, should again be clear to his congregation about the role of the church, no matter what, the importance of the church being a critic of all parties, and again the value of democracy itself. And some people will extrapolate from that in certain ways, and those extrapolations may be fair, but I think that's our call in this moment. I do think that, I mean, Brian and I went because we do have, just again, we're willing to suffer for our audience. We went to one of the We Awaken American tour stops in Branson, Missouri.
Man, you guys have a kink for this stuff.
Well, that'll be fair. This guy sat across the street in the hotel lobby in case he needed to run in and save me. I'm the one that went in. But anyways,
I was watching the live stream. It was legit scary. I mean, first off, it was scary in terms of the number of people showing up. It was scary in terms of what was being said and proclaimed as Christian from the stage. And then to me, the grossest thing about it was we went to, after the event stages were over, some of the speakers were doing baptisms, and they had run out a local hotel pool and they were doing baptisms. And I'm talking not 5 or 6 baptisms. I'm talking scores of baptisms.
Hundreds.
In this hotel pool as a part of the Reawaken America Tour event. So it was.
And this is the thing that Mike Flynn is a part of, right?
But Roger Stone, Lance Wallnau, Eric and Donald Trump. I mean, this is very much a Trump.
The Pillow Guy, is he part of this too?
What's that?
Is the Pillow Guy a part of this too?
Yes. The Pillow Guy was there. The Pillow Hugger was there. Sean Foyt sang at that one. And so, yeah, this is a big deal. And this is the Trump is anointed. Trump is coming back. Also, COVID isn't real. 5G is trying to kill you. There's lots of conspiracy theories. You kind of throw them all in together, but it's being mainstreamed as Christian.
And again, they're taking our right. So if we all think about what baptism is supposed to be, dying to ourselves, rising in Christ, like this sort of public symbol of loyalty to who we follow as Lord and Savior. And it's being co-opted to basically be, I'm baptizing you, yes, in Jesus's name, but I'm baptizing you to be a part of this MAGA movement. I mean, it was one of the grosser things I've ever seen in my, observations of religion in public life. It was scary.
So, Brian, what's your advice to Tier Hardy?
So one of the things we could do now in setting the stage with ministers like the very right Reverend Tier Hardy, it would be to help people separate the God claims from this cycle. I mean, it's going to happen. I mean, it's already happening. Donald Trump's had a video that basically proclaims him as the Messiah to save the world. And I mean, he's played it at his campaign rallies. He didn't make the video, but he's adopted it. He's accepted it. I mean, there's a place for us to talk about the fact that we need to be careful about false prophets, about charlatans who will try to tell us what God's will is. And this is work that we really have to be doing now, which is why I'm glad the book is coming out early summer as opposed to, right before the election or even after. We have to help people see that God's name is being misused. It is being used in vain.
There's a commandment for that.
Yeah, that's right. There is, to try to, and it's not about cursing. I mean, it's about this kind of thing. This is what it's really about, using God's name in vain, to convince us that a certain political agenda is what you have to vote, is what you have to do. And can we lessen this and say, this political elections are tough decisions, and you all are going to have to weigh the consequences. And it's not that you're going to hell or you're going to heaven based on the way you vote. That's not what the gospel teaches. That a good and faithful Christian can vote this way or that way, and we can disagree. But let's not make this a first tier thing. Now, post-election, I mean, I do think we're going to have those kinds of conversations in our churches about, how the church responds when things don't go your way. And I think the question of violence or a nonviolent approach is going to be really important for pastors to help tone down the rhetoric, particularly the violent imagery.
So I just got an urgent text from our publisher who somehow is listening into this recording. And he said that the advice that Tier Hardy needs to receive is to do a congregational-wide study of Baptizing America, make sure everybody in the church has a copy, and that they read it and recommend it to their friends. So
I think that's great advice.
Well, I was just going to say, if Brian and Bo, if they can go to Branson, Missouri for, whatever that fest was, Jason, CPAC is coming back to DC in 2025. Maybe you and I could go to CPAC in 2025 together. Tier Hardy and Jason Micheli at CPAC. And
set up a crackers and grape juice recording. I mean, and get people on the pod. It'll be great.
Oh my gosh.
We could be sponsors next year of CPAC.
It's the Star Wars bar of the Republican Party. It's just so crazy. Brian, you probably already know this, but it is the 90th anniversary of the Barmen Declaration coming up. So it seems a little on point.
Yeah, fair.
All right. Well, so in your own voice, give us the title of the book and where people can find it and find you guys.
Sure. The book is Baptizing America: How Mainline Protestants Helped Build Christian Nationalism. You can find the book right now for pre-order anywhere you want to buy your book. You can, go to one of those mega chains that, our publisher doesn't like Amazon, but go ahead and buy it there if you want. You can go to chalice.com and buy the book directly from the publisher. But anywhere you want to buy your book, type it in, pre-order it today. That way you don't have to remember to do it again later. You can also find us writing much more regularly at publicwitness.wordandway.org. Sign up and you'll get in-depth analysis on religion and politics sent right to your inbox.
Boom. Thank you, guys.
Awesome.
Thank you. Really appreciate this conversation, friends.
Yeah, very much.